There is a photograph the FBI has that you and I will never see. It is a close-up of the porch outside Nancy Guthrie's front door in the Callella foothills of Tucson, Arizona. It shows the tile just to the left of the welcome mat. On that tile, there are three shapes, two round droplets about the size of a dime, and one long smear, roughly 4 inches, that trails from the droplets toward the front step. That photograph was taken on February 7th, 2026. And this week, a former FBI supervisory special agent named Steve Moore, appearing on NewsNation and republished across almost every major outlet, said the sentence that has quietly rewritten this entire investigation. He said, and I want you to hear this exactly the way he said it. There is a very strong possibility that Nancy didn't survive long enough for them to even get a ransom note. Didn't survive long enough for a ransom note. Every word in that sentence is doing work. Because if Steve Moore is right, and he is one of the most decorated kidnapping investigators the Bureau ever trained, then every phone call the Guthrie family has received in the last 172 days claiming to have her, every ransom letter, every text, every so-called sighting has been a lie from the very first hour. Stay with me. Because the porch already told us what happened. Everyone has just spent almost 6 months refusing to read it. Before we go one step further, let me tell you who Steve Moore is. Because in true crime coverage, everybody with a badge on a jacket gets called an expert. Moore is not that. He spent 25 years as an FBI supervisory special agent. He led kidnapping investigations in Los Angeles. He was part of the team that worked the Ariel Castro case in Cleveland after the recovery. He has testified in front of Congress on kidnapping for ransom methodology. And he has, for the last decade since his retirement, been one of the small handful of former Bureau officials the major networks turn to when they need someone who can actually read a crime scene the way an agent reads it. When Moore says something on NewsNation, he is not doing a hot take. He is doing a reading. And this week, he read the Guthrie porch out loud on national television. And what he saw in it was not what the family has been hoping for. Let's walk through it. The porch outside Nancy Guthrie's home is not complicated. It is a small tiled entryway with a welcome mat, a potted succulent to the right of the door, a wrought iron light fixture, and a Nest camera mounted above. The blood evidence on that porch, according to the initial report, leaked to the Arizona Republic in February and never publicly disputed by the Sheriff's Department, consists of 3 components: 2 roughly circular droplets and 1 linear smear. Bloodstain-pattern analysts, which is the technical name for the forensic scientists who read scenes like this, have a very specific way of interpreting those 3 shapes together. Round droplets with clean edges and no distortion generally indicate blood falling from a wound at a low velocity onto a stable surface, meaning the person was standing or being held upright when those droplets fell. The smear, on the other hand, indicates contact, blood on skin or blood on cloth being dragged across the surface, meaning the body was moved. Round drops, then a smear leading toward the step tells a story that any bloodstain analyst in the country can read in about 10 seconds. Someone was injured on the porch. Then that person was moved. That is not a struggle. A struggle produces a much more chaotic pattern. This is more surgical. And it is exactly the kind of pattern Steve Moore was talking about when he made his statement. Now let's go back to what Moore actually said, because every phrase in it matters. Very strong possibility. Not certain, not confirmed. A possibility that, in his professional reading, is very strong. That is the language of an experienced agent giving you his best read without crossing into a conclusion he can't legally defend. Didn't survive. That is the key phrase. Not was killed, not was murdered, didn't survive, which is a very deliberate choice. Because in Moore's reading, the injury on the porch itself may have been fatal or may have proved fatal within the first few minutes after she was moved. Nobody in the public knows whether that means a fall, a strike, a medical event triggered by the encounter, or something worse. Moore did not speculate. Long enough, meaning she may have lived for some short window after the encounter. Minutes, perhaps, not days, for them to even get a ransom note. This is the phrase that flips the case, because a ransom-motivated kidnapping requires the victim to be alive long enough for the abductors to contact the family. Steve Moore is saying in his professional read that the window between the encounter on the porch and the moment Nancy Guthrie was no longer survivable was, in all likelihood, shorter than the window it would have taken any real abductor to compose and deliver a ransom demand. Which means in Moore's reading, no real ransom demand was ever going to come, and everyone that did come was a con. Now let's connect this to what the family has actually experienced, because since February 7th, the Guthries have received, at last public count, at least 11 separate communications claiming to have custody of Nancy or knowledge of where she is being held. Some of them were laughed off in the first minute. Others were serious enough that the FBI opened parallel investigations into the senders. The most widely reported of these came from a Boston area extortionist named Anthony Callella, who allegedly sent multiple written demands to the family with specific dollar amounts and specific delivery instructions. Callella is now facing federal wire fraud and extortion charges. A second cluster of letters was mailed to TMZ and other celebrity news outlets in the hope that the family would see them. Investigators traced those to at least 2 different senders, none of them, as far as the public record shows, ever in physical contact with Nancy Guthrie herself. And here is where Steve Moore's reading of the porch becomes devastating. If Moore is right, and the encounter on that porch produced a fatal or rapidly fatal injury before any abductor could have plausibly composed a ransom demand, then every single one of those letters, every one of those texts, every one of those phone calls was written by someone who never had her, not one of them. And the family, in the middle of the worst grief of their lives, was forced to negotiate with ghosts for 172 days. There is a principle in kidnapping investigation called the First Hour Doctrine. It is not a law, it is a probability curve, and it is one of the most cited teaching tools in FBI training on elderly abduction cases. The First Hour Doctrine says this: for victims over the age of 70, the probability of long-term survival after an abduction drops sharply within the first 60 minutes, sharply enough that agents are trained to treat any elderly victim kidnapping from the first minute of the response as a potential recovery rather than rescue operation. The reasons are, unfortunately, straightforward. Elderly victims are more likely to have pre-existing medical conditions that an abduction can rapidly worsen. Cardiac events, strokes, falls, even the physical stress of being moved against their will can, in an 84-year-old body, become fatal within minutes. Nancy Guthrie was 84. She was, by all family accounts, in relatively good health for her age, but she was still 84. And the First Hour Doctrine, combined with the blood pattern on her porch, is exactly the frame Steve Moore was using when he told NewsNation what he told them. He was not being cruel. He was reading the case the way his training taught him to read it. And the training was built on decades of cases that ended the same way. If Steve Moore's reading is correct, and let me repeat, this is a reading, not a confirmed finding, then the investigation itself has to change shape. Because the FBI is not looking for a kidnapper with a living hostage anymore. They are looking for a person or persons who caused a fatal or rapidly fatal injury on a porch, then moved a body, then vanished. That is a different kind of criminal. That is a different kind of profile. That is a different kind of search. It changes what evidence matters. Tire tracks in the wash behind the house, which local investigators have been re-examining as part of the Day 172 reset, become more important than they seemed. Cell tower pings within a certain radius on the morning of February 7th become more important. Land movement patterns in the surrounding desert, patterns weather and time have almost certainly disturbed by now, become more important. And the ransom letters, which have consumed enormous FBI resources in the first 6 months of the case, become almost useless. Because if Moore is right, none of those letters ever led anywhere real. They were all noise. And the signal, the actual signal, has been sitting on that porch since February 7th. Savannah Guthrie has not commented on Steve Moore's statement. She is unlikely to. The family's public posture from the first day has been one of active hope. Cammie Guthrie's statement in May used the phrase, "Our mother is coming home." Savannah's on-air reference to her mother in a Today Show moment in April used the phrase, "We know she is out there," present tense, alive. That posture is, in every meaningful sense, the correct one for a family in the middle of an active investigation. You do not bury someone the government has not declared deceased. You do not grieve in past tense until the person you are grieving has been recovered. That is not denial. That is love. But the reading Steve Moore offered this week creates a very difficult space around the family, because the investigators off the record are almost certainly reading the porch the same way Moore is. And the distance between what the family is saying in public and what the agents are quietly preparing for in private has been widening every single day since February. That distance is the hardest part of a case like this, and it is the part no one wants to talk about because there is no kind way to say it. If Moore's reading is right and recovery becomes the operational posture of the investigation, then here is what the coming weeks realistically look like. Search parties will begin quietly in expanding circles from the Guthrie property, dry washes, desert scrubland, abandoned properties within a 15-mile radius. Cadaver dogs will be redeployed on land that was searched in February when the weather was different. Ground-penetrating radar teams, borrowed from the University of Arizona's geology department, as they have been in past Pima County cases, will start on properties that flagged during the earlier canvass. None of this will be publicly announced. Recovery searches almost never are. But the family will know, the neighborhood will notice. And at some point in the coming weeks or months, the FBI will either bring Nancy Guthrie home in the way no family ever wants to see, or they will not. And the case, either way, will begin to resolve into something the investigators can finally close. Here is what I want to sit with for just a minute before we close. Steve Moore's sentence is the hardest thing anyone in a public platform has said about this case. And he did not say it to be cruel. He said it because his entire career has trained him to read scenes the way most of us read a book. And when he reads the Guthrie porch, he sees a story that started and ended essentially in the same place. He sees a woman who opened her door to something she did not expect. He sees an injury that happened on that tile. He sees a body that was moved. And he sees 172 days of ransom letters and phone calls and speculation and live stream tents, none of which ever had anything to do with what actually happened on that porch. The porch already gave the answer. Everyone spent almost 6 months refusing to read it. That is not a criticism of the family. That is not a criticism of the Bureau. That is just what happens when a case moves faster than grief can keep up with. There is a photograph the FBI has that you and I will never see. 2 round droplets, 1 long smear, a story that took a decorated former agent about 10 seconds to read on national television and about 6 months for the rest of us to be ready to hear. Steve Moore did not say Nancy Guthrie is dead. He said there is a very strong possibility she did not survive long enough for the ransom demand every con artist in America has been trying to send to her family. Those are not the same sentence. But they are close enough that the investigation, in its quiet reset this week, is now almost certainly acting on the shorter version. If a recovery is coming, it is coming soon. If Steve Moore is wrong, and I hope he is, then the porch is still telling us a story we are all misreading. And Nancy Guthrie is somewhere none of the math has been able to find her. Subscribe if you want the update the moment the search perimeter widens. And say a quiet word tonight for the family that is still holding on to the present tense 172 days after the tile on their mother's porch tried to tell them what had happened.